Hi guys, this is Mrs. Karaz, and we're looking at Chapter 17, Section 3 today, the Cattle Kingdom. Okay, so at this time we have groups of wild cattle, and remember cattle equals cows, which had grown from strays that were lost by Spanish ranchers, wandering the open range. And when we say open range, we mean the unfenced land, and here we're talking about Texas particularly. Originally, when people moved to Texas, they left the cattle alone because there was no practical way to use this cattle for food. Realistically, the desire for meat was out east, and there was no way to ship the cattle meat, aka beef, out east once cows had been killed. But now we have railroads developing, which means that the beef industry can develop. Meat can be slaughtered, for lack of a better term, in the West, and shipped back east. So in the 1860s, in order to aid this beef industry, ranchers began rounding up cattle. Skilled horseback riders who knew how to herd cattle, aka cowhands, were hired to move the cattle towards rail lines. That was the idea. The name for herding and moving cattle over a long distance is a cattle drive. And initially, right, when all of the cattle was really spread out, there would be long drives where we had to take animals that were very far away from rail lines and move them closer. These initial long drives could last 2 to 3 months, and they followed well-worn trails for the most part. Cowhands preferred to travel in the spring when the grasses were tall and rivers overflowed. This means cows have something to eat and something to drink, and the cowhands themselves do not have to buy food or provide for them in any way. Nature provides. But even with nature providing for these rides in some extent, the long drives were hard and dangerous. For one example that our textbook chose to highlight for us, Andy Adams was a cowhand who witnessed his cattle go blind because they were so thirsty, right? Nature provides, but also sometimes it doesn't. So on his particular long drive, there were no clean sources of clean water for the cattle to drink. They went blind from that thirst, and when they finally found water, their sight returned. Imagine how traumatic that is, and imagine being a cowhand trying to wrangle cows that can't see. There were lots of different problems that could arise for cowhands. Andy Adams' example is one of them. But there's also the risk of lightning and thunder during inclement weather. It could scare cattle and send them off on a stampede. Swift river currents could sometimes carry cattle away. Grass fires were common, which is obviously another danger. Cattle sometimes got caught in swamps. Thieves sometimes tried to steal cattle. And for all this, for dealing with all these potential problems, cowhands received less than $1 per day as pay. Cowhands received help in their journeys from Spanish vaqueros or cowhands/cowboys. Vaqueros taught Americans how to rope, ride, and brand cattle. Cowboys wore Mexican spurs on their boots and leather chaps to keep their legs safe. These were both introduced by the vaqueros. And the iconic cowboy hat that we think of when we think about those movies that take place in the Wild West came from the Mexican sombrero. It's actually just a variation on that. Cowboys, again, like we see in lots of movies, used a lasso to catch cattle and horses. A third of cowhands were Mexican. African Americans and white Civil War veterans also tended to be drawn to the job. It's in some ways similar to what we talked about with Buffalo Soldiers, right? You want a purpose following the war. Here's something tangible that you can do, and you're going to see the visual sign of your accomplishment at the end of the day, or at the end of that 2 to 3 month long drive, as the case may be. Speaking of the Wild Wild West, and no, not the Will Smith movie, but the actual one, in 1867, Joseph McCoy founded Abilene, Kansas, a place for cowboys to rest and for cattle to be penned as they waited for a train to bring them east, right? You couldn't always be on the road. This was a stopping point. And Abilene became known as the first cow town, and cow towns were the nicknames given to settlements at the end of a cattle trail. Cow towns featured hotels, dance halls, saloons, and restaurants that served cowboys. Drinking and gambling led to bar fights, and this created the image of the Wild West, right? That anything can happen, that there's danger out west. And remember, we also talked about how law enforcement was not always in place in the West. Towns could spring up so quickly before law enforcement could be created. So this also lends itself to that image. Thinking about some people that are significant to the Wild Wild West, we have William Buffalo Bill Cody. He was a former buffalo hunter who created a Wild West show. The show featured cowboys, gunslinging, and Native Americans performing archery and horseback riding stunts. They staged performances of actual events, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, again, helped create this idea in our heads of the Wild West. They performed these stories. They broadened the audience that was becoming familiar with them. So again, this kind of became part of American culture thanks to these shows. We have Annie Oakley, which you've heard of. She was a female sharpshooter. She broke gender stereotypes in a lot of ways. And remember, again, we've talked about previously, gender stereotypes in the West, or gender roles in the West, were more fluid than they were in the East. So that's worth remembering. So just like we had booms when it came to the gold rush, we now have the region. We now have what comes to be known as the cattle boom. The region dominated by the cattle industry and its ranches, trails, and cow towns was called the Cattle Kingdom, and they used that word intentionally. During the cattle boom, when a lot of people were getting into the beef industry, when there was a high desire for beef from the West, profits were extremely high. You could make a lot of money in this industry. There was breeding done so that there were new breeds of cattle which caught fewer diseases and produced more meat. And this made the beef industry even more successful. They were able to produce more efficiently. And so we had a lot of Easterners and Europeans investing money in the Western cattle industry because things were going so well for a while until they weren't. So the cattle boom ultimately went bust, and here are the reasons. So first of all, we have more cattle roaming in the open range than could actually be supported by the resources there. Okay, so we talked about the grass and water that was just nature providing. If there are too many animals relying on that source, it's going to run out, right? There were a cycle of scorching summers and freezing winters that killed cattle just because of those environmental conditions alone, but also limited the food supply again. We get an economic depression around this time, and that means people are spending, or less capable of spending money, so often they can't afford beef, which is a more expensive meat, so the demand went down. Going back to the environmental factors, we have sheep competing with cattle for roaming territory. They want to eat and drink the same water that the cattle do, so we have competition. And then, to take it even further, some farmers fenced in their territory to protect their crops from the cattle that would graze on it. All of this adds up to say that cows can't get the nutrition that they need at this time. If you wanted to be in the cattle industry, you couldn't just rely on nature as they had been in the past. Farmers would have to invest in expensive feed that could be given to the cattle. And farmers weren't in the position, again, we have economic depression at this time, to spend money on that feed. They wanted to just make profit off of cattle. They didn't want to be spending money on it. So as quickly as the boom occurred, the cattle bust comes rolling around as well. And that wraps us up for this section, my friends. Have a lovely, lovely afternoon.